Hey everyone! Today I'll be going through the process of another illustration. Now a few people on my socials have commented that they like how I draw a spear, and he is my favourite, to put it lightly, so I thought I might show y'all how I go about drawing him. So I'm doing a few thumbnails here, and while I do these I'm thinking of the shapes of the character, which helps with different angles and poses. He's made up of mostly triangles from his crest, torso, feet, even his horn and eyes can be roughed in as triangles. It helps to break these shapes down, because it's easier to imagine them simple shapes in a 3D space rather than trying to draw a whole character and thinking about 3D at the same time. You can also use references to make sure you're getting the form right. Otherwise you might be just drawing something completely wrong. I'm going for an action pose in this piece. I'm not feeling most of these, but this last one I really like. I got the idea to draw him in a sort of suspended leaf swirl, and I'm already filling in some of the elements, so I think this thumbnail's the winner. Since I'm so happy with the composition of the thumbnail, I'm gonna scale it up and just draw my sketch right on top. There are a few details I need to go back and add to the thumbnail, but it's easier to do that when you're using separate layers, so make sure you're drawing on the right layer and you're not losing a lot of work when it goes to deleting these. When doing a more refined sketch, I'm really focusing on getting the look of the lines to be pretty close to how I want my line art to look. Doing a rough sketch first and then adding a more refined sketch on top helps keep the strong shapes of that initial thumbnail, while also having that refinement that makes it easier to put your line art down. And also putting the details in once you've already got the strong shapes down also stops things from looking stiff once they've been more refined, which can be a problem if you're focusing too much on the details. Some things I make sure to add in this stage are like the thickness of his arms and legs, giving that small taper Sonic characters have. Espio has especially thin arms compared to Sonic, and especially Shadow. There's less of a taper for his arms, but his legs have a little bit. Also, the thickness of his shoe soles are thicker at the heels and thin out to the toes. I'm also giving the fabric of the sandals some volume by adding a part that wraps over his foot. It helps them actually look like shoes and not just painted on stripes. Drawing his gloves can be quite difficult, but if you break them down into smaller shapes, it's actually a bit easier. You just draw two bands with bandages in between, and then it's just some rectangles with some thickness, and then you put more rectangles on top. That's a pretty rough explanation of it, but it's the easiest way to explain that. I'm adjusting the size of his head. It wasn't quite big enough, but that's easy enough to do during the sketch phase. And I'm just roughing in some leaves, just to give them a more abstract shape, so I'm not just drawing leaves and having them look a bit too samey. Having a more abstract shape to the foreground elements really helps emphasize the movement that I want it to come across. Also, having them be more broader and abstract gives more focus to the things that are more refined and in detail. You don't want everything to be super refined on an image, or it can get very cluttered and unfocused. I'm also emphasizing the motion using his tail, because he doesn't really have any hair or dangling drapey clothes. It also takes the pressure off having to draw that spiral, which I find tricky sometimes, especially in the line art. And I'm making sure I have him exactly where I want him on the canvas. Doing this as early as possible is a pretty good idea. With my line art, I'm making it very thin, so it can show the shading more, but I'm putting thicker lines around his eyes to give more interest to the face. Something to keep in mind when drawing line art is to try and make your points quite sharp, and also trying to get your lines to be not intersecting too much. It's also a good time to check out for tangents on your image, where things almost touch but don't, and try to make those overlap. Also, trying to get a nice smooth edge wherever there's a curve, because big curves show off imperfections a lot more than small details. I can really add the tiniest extra details at this stage as well. Drawing hands can be quite difficult in the line art stage, but having a really good detailed base sketch really helps. I'm quite used to drawing hands now by this point, but you would probably want things to be a little more refined if you struggle, and even using references during the sketch phase is a good idea. I like adding little extra bits and pieces here and there in the line art that I don't add to my sketch, just because I think of it in that moment. You don't have to plan everything ahead if you know what you're doing. And I've been drawing a spear for a very long time, so I have some idea of how I like him to look. The bandages, I like to keep quite broad strokes. That's how they tend to look in comics and even Sonic X. That's generally how I draw them. Long lines like this can be very difficult, but it's so much easier than doing a spiral. Just making sure that you try to keep them like free and broad. Drawing them quickly is a good way of doing that. Using the rough blobs I made for the leaves gives me more abstract and dynamic shapes than if I just drew them in. It also helps the leaves to look different and not all the same. They're helping to show the motion of the swirling wind this way. If your image is simple, having elements like this to emphasize what you're trying to portray, whether that's movement, feeling, or if it's like cold or the character's doing something, just gives it more interest than just having a character. I'm adding more fine lines as we move into focus. Things being more focused and refined in the middle of the image where the character is helps bring things together, and that way you have a focal point. It's not just everything in the same level of focus. Otherwise, pictures can get cluttered really easily. And with the water splash I have added here, I'm just using an eraser to taper things so there's a nice round bead at the end of the splashes. Water has this thing called surface tension, which means there's like a thin membrane and it causes it to ball up where it starts to drop back down again once it's splashing. And then I'm just making the tails of the water very sharp. Also, having these elements not lined really helps things that are lined stand out more. Things like the leaves and the character. And since this is a leaf swirl, having the leaves be lined makes them all stand out. And yeah, that is the purpose. I've deleted my sketch layer, now I'm just working on everything looking right before I colour the leaves. And leaves often look quite glowy, transparent. I like to go for the more Sonic Heroes style glowy look. And because I know the background isn't going to be a perfect white canvas, I added a bit of white behind the water just to help it stand out, so it doesn't just look super muddy on top of whatever colour I put on it. I don't fully go with this colour, but it's good to have an idea off the bat of what you're gonna do. Picking the right purple can be quite challenging. Some models have a sort of bluish magenta, some official art is more reddish, so it helps to just go through IDW and check out what they... Oh god, that's not helpful at all! Just pick whatever purple you want, I guess. He's a chameleon. Whatever works. I'm not using a stark white where the white is. It makes it easier to, when I get to the shading, that way I can actually highlight the white. And also not using a true black colour. Having a dark grey is better. Having the choice to be able to shade something black or highlight something white is important for value and balance. And I use quite a muddy gold colour. I just like how it looks when you add the highlights. That more tan colour I got from Sonic X actually, for his face and tummy. Just trying to get the mood of the lighting down. Now for shading, I'm just gonna go in with a grey and a normal layer for the time being, just so I can see exactly where I'm putting my shading. And having big shapes helps me figure out the where the light source is. Also, it just looks better to have big shadows, but you can go in and add smaller shadows afterwards. Like with the lines for his ribs or his lips, you add little notches, and it pushes those small details a little deeper than just the big shadows. It can be quite tricky to know exactly where to place shadows, and I wouldn't say I'm amazing at it, but it just takes a little bit of thought and practice. And also it helps to study how things warp around certain shapes. When something's very thin and round, the shadows tend to be more bendy. So keep that in mind when you're shading things like limbs and his tail. Where there's things that are flatter, like his shoes, tend to have flatter shadows. And again, I'm just filling in all the big blocky shadows with a bucket tool. And I'm using this grey colour just so I can see exactly where I'm putting all the shading. And that way I can really tell if it's in the right place and it doesn't just look weird and jumbled. Obviously you can't really see it very well on the kunai at the moment, but I dropped the opacity of the colours underneath, and then it helps me to be able to see that better. I'm also doing this on a clipping layer. It saves me from having to try and select the areas I want to colour. Clipping layers are the best. Again, just doing those big shadows first and then adding those small details in after. Big first, then little. If I was really trying to make this look good, I would make those smaller shadows a lighter colour. Now, I'm changing to the colour I actually want the shading, and I'm going in with the pixels locked so that I can warm up the edges where the light is coming in from. Shadows being all one colour can be nice, but adding a bit of temperature to the shadows makes them more interesting. I'm also adding this green, this cool green, to the side where the light isn't. I'm already having some green elements in the image, so that will help bring it together a little better. It's not going to look like this in the end, but it already pops more and is more interesting. But then I convert this to multiply. After the shading, I'm going in with some highlights, and I'm using this nice warm orange colour to really emphasise that sunsetty palette I've decided to go with. And of course, with the amount of shine I'm giving him, he does look quite oiled up, weirdly enough. Like a bit like a bodybuilder, but it's just how I like to make him look. Also, he's not diffused, like he doesn't have any fur to diffuse the light, so it just looking stark like this emphasises that. Scales are quite glossy and shiny. Keeping in mind what the material is that you're highlighting is helpful. I did say with the tails video that wool has a sort of glow to it, but it is quite diffused. Here, there's a lot of metal. I'm not really adding too much highlight to the bandages because fabric tends to pull light in and not really reflect it very much, but things like his bracelets, like his gauntlets, they're metal, so they're very shiny. Also, I like to think of his shoes as being kind of leathery, and leather tends to reflect light, so I do add some highlights to the shoes as well. And of course, because I'm keeping in mind the colour palette and the lighting, I added some more of that sunsetty colour to the water, because water is very reflective as well. Shapes that swirl around like this can be difficult to figure out the light source of, so just do your best is all I can say on that. I've changed that to add glow layer, and I'm just putting that where I want it to look good. Then I'm locking the pixels on that, and not only am I warming up the very edges of the light where it's closest to the shading, but then I'll go back in with an eraser, just a soft eraser, and where the light is starting to pull away from the shapes, I soften it a little. It just makes it a little more interesting than just a stark white highlight that's all the same level. And I am going in and diffusing some of those highlights, I'm not really sure where I was going with these speckles on his eye, but they look okay, I guess. It's just an artistic choice that I don't really understand now. I'm doing more erasing towards the left side of the image, obviously. And I'm making sure that that light in his eye is highlighted nicely as well. I'm adjusting the framing of the image because it was looking a little long. And now I'm pushing those leaves right to the top of the image and making sure that they're the right kind of layer I like. And then I'm going in with the larger foreground elements and I'm adding a blur to those so they're less focused. So again, we have that sharp look in the middle. I'm also adding a motion blur to the leaves so that they look like they're more in motion, even more so. Once I figured out how I want all the foreground elements to look, I'm adding a motion blur to the character using a duplicated version of him and all his layers. And I'm pushing that motion blur downwards so it looks like he's rising up really quickly. But we don't want the character to look all blurry like that, so I'm gonna put that motion on top and I'm softly erasing the details that I want back in. Sort of like I'm slowly undoing that blur. And now I'm just checking that I have everything the way I like it. I'm finally going to change that background color to a sunset-y sort of look. And that's just really gonna pull it all together. With the shading, the lighting, and now the background. And the final touch is just to go back in with the leaves and make them look super nice and glowy. And with that, we're done with the picture. I hope you like this one. And yeah, I worked really hard on this one. But yeah, if you like my art, why don't you check out my comic on Tapas? Team Chaotix Detective Agency. Starring the Chaotix and a few of your favorite characters maybe. Some new characters and lots of mysteries, lots of fun, bit of action, and maybe some drama. Check it out on Tapas.